What's going on, kids? Today we're going to take a look at some different parts that are inside of our motors, and then also go and take a look at these engines once they're assembled and in our car, so we can identify if it's a 4-cylinder, a 6-cylinder, what shape it's in. Is it an inline 4 or a V6? And then also be able to look at where our cylinder head is and where our block is, so we can kind of see that path of travel of air as it's going in and out of our motor. So starting on the bottom end of our motor, we've got our cylinder block. And this happens to be a V8. This is an LS block, so it's all aluminum. It's a pushrod motor, so the cam actually runs right through the center of the block. You can see there's some bearings in there. They're not traditional bearings in the sense of like ball bearings, but they're just real thin pieces of metal with a little hole for oil to go through. Looking down each side, because this is a V8, we've got 4 cylinders going that way and 4 cylinders going this way. It's aluminum, and then there is a steel sleeve in here that kind of gives some stronger material around where the pistons are at. Because this is a pushrod motor with a single cam, our cylinder head's going to look a little bit different than we're used to seeing on a 4-cylinder or something in a more late model engine, or I guess a more common engine, where the cylinder head is going to sit right up on the top like this, and then we've got our valve train up top. So we've got a cutaway of our cylinder head, and if I flip this over, we can see there are 2 valves, and this is our combustion chamber, an area for a spark plug to go in, and we have a single large intake valve and then a single smaller exhaust valve. If we look up at the top side, we've got our valve, we've got our retainer, our valve's on the inside, here's our valve. We've got our valve spring. We have our keepers, these 2 little half-moon shaped things that we'll see when we pull them apart, and our retainer, which is this top metal bit. This is a cutaway, so we can see that this is actually our exhaust port. So the air is going to get pushed out of our cylinder and then shoot out this side of our head on the exhaust. And then if we look over on the intake side, we've got these giant exhaust ports that, if we could actually see in there, you can kind of see the back side of the valve down in there. The air will go in through that hole and then gets drawn into the motor here when the piston pulls down. So here's our piston that sits inside the block. And you see we've got our connecting rod, the piston itself, and a wrist pin. So the wrist pin allows the connecting rod to swing kind of side to side, the same way your wrist is allowed to kind of move side to side. You can move your wrist back and forth. This piston will also move back and forth just like that. As the crank spins, not only does it go up and down with those offset bits, but it goes right and left. So this wrist pin allows it to do that. Also on the piston, you're going to see there are 3 rings. These are ring lands, the kind of the metal bits between. And our top 2 rings here, you'll see they're solid. These are our compression rings. They hold the air up top. And then we've got our oil ring on the bottom that keeps the oil on the bottom, in the block. You can also see on this set of pistons, these are super old, from a Buick, I think. This is what happens when you drop a valve, right? When a valve breaks and that piston is going up 10, 15, 20, 60 times a second, if that valve drops, it's going to sit there and pepper the top of this thing, and it can punch a hole straight through it. So this is catastrophic failure of a piston. Back to the bottom of our motor, this is not the correct crankshaft. This is a crankshaft from a regular small block Chevy, like a cast iron, just 5.7. And this is the block from an LS. So it's a little bit different, but so you can see it doesn't fit. But you can see that we've got these offshoots. There's a center line, sorry, here, and here, and out here. And then we've got these offshoots here, down there, and up here. So the crankshaft spins on that center, and then these offshoot bits are what connect to the end of our connecting rod. As it spins, it goes up and down, and also right to left, and that's what pulls the pistons down, pushes the pistons back up. So this is probably a more traditional motor that you're going to see in your own cars at home. This is an inline 4. We can tell that because there's 1, 2, 3, 4 holes for spark plugs running right down the middle. And this is a dual overhead cam motor. So what that means is instead of having one cam running right down the middle or a single cam running right down the middle over the head to control the intake valves and the exhaust valves, there's actually two. And we can tell that by looking at the outside of a motor because the side of our head is going to have a much wider cover on it because we need room for these two cam gears. And this is that cam phaser that I talked about that fills with oil pressure and rotates the cam forwards and backwards to advance or retard our valve timing. But if we open up our valve cover, well, we can look at our valve cover first. We can see these two kind of humps on here. And if we lift the valve cover up, we can see our camshaft with the lobes. So again, this is a dual overhead cam motor. So we have two exhaust valves, and we're going to have two exhaust valves over here on this side and two intake valves over here on this side. We can see our lobe comes around, and then here's our little rocker assembly where the lobe, you can see it's touching this little roller, and then as the lobe comes around, it pushes on this roller, which pushes down on the valve in there, which compresses the spring, opens the valve, and allows the exhaust to get pushed up from the piston and then come out this exhaust port on the back. In the case of this motor, over to our turbocharger. So here we are all together in our Del Sol. This is actually the motor out of a CRV. The good thing about Hondas is they're kind of like Legos. You can take motors and transmissions from a whole bunch of different Hondas and kind of slap them into whatever Honda you want to. But if we look at this, we can follow our intake track and see our air is going to come in through this intake tube, and then it goes into what's called an intake manifold. This intake manifold, you can see it takes all of the air through our throttle body, so this is what opens and closes when you press your accelerator, and it goes into this log, and then from there the air gets split into 1, 2, 3, 4 intake runners that then go into our motor, and then the intake valves are underneath this lump. So this is a dual overhead cam motor. We see the side of our motor has a cover over it that's the size for two of those gears. Intake cam is under here, intake cam gear is under there. We have 4 spark plugs right in a row, right down the middle of our head. So it's an inline 4, dual overhead cam. And then our exhaust cam is underneath this lump. And we can see 1, 2, 3, 4 exhaust ports on our head. And then it goes into our exhaust manifold, also known as a header. And the shape of it, some people may call it a long tube header if it's longer tubes, the runners are longer. So, but in the lab, I ask you to circle your intake manifold. So in this case, it looks like that. We can just follow our air box or your air intake up to the bit of metal that spiders off. Find your cylinder head, so just kind of circle that top bit of your motor, and then circle your exhaust manifold. Now, this is all nice and open because this is a race car and we've pulled out all the things that we don't need. But let's take a look at the Honda Accord we have in the shop and see if we can still identify all of these pieces with a whole lot more underneath the hood. So this is the 2001 or 2 Accord, I don't remember what it is. But we have our air box here. So this is where our air gets drawn in from our air filter. And we can follow that up down the intake tube. Here's our throttle. And then up on top, we've got this giant chunk of aluminum. Now, on the other Civic, or on the Civic, we called that an intake manifold. I would refer to this one as an intake plenum because it's going to be 2 pieces. Manifold and plenum, just kind of 2 ways of saying the same thing. So the air is going to be coming down through this one central bit and then split off into these 2 separate sections. And then it's going to go down into our cylinder head, which is down here. And we can see on this side, we've got 1, 2, 3 spark plugs. These are coil-on plug. We'll talk about those next. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intake runners. And on the back side of our motor, we can see we've got 1, 2, 3 ignition coils back there. So we got 3 cylinders going that way, 3 cylinders going that way. We've got ourselves a V6, intake manifold up on top, a cylinder head over here underneath this cover, and we have our exhaust manifold down here. So we can't see the exhaust manifold on this one because it's covered by a heat shield. that's okay. Your cars will have your exhaust covered by a heat shield. So just kind of find that bit of sheet metal, and you can see the exhaust tube kind of right down in there. That's there because this exhaust manifold is usually somewhere, north of 1,000 degrees. So they put a heat shield on there just so you don't burn yourself too bad if you accidentally touch it. But don't get me wrong, you will still burn the crap out of yourself. All right, so hopefully after that, popping your hood and taking a look at what's going on in there is a little bit less intimidating, right? Hopefully we can identify if it is a V6 or an inline 4 or an inline 6 or a W16, right? We're just looking at the shape of our spark plugs and where they're at in relation to our cylinder head to figure out if it is a single overhead cam or a dual overhead cam. If the plugs are right down the middle, it's dual overhead cam. If they are off to one side of the cylinder head, then it's probably single overhead cam. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, be good, and I will see you next time.